This podcast is sponsored by Talkspace. You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.
Welcome back to the Center in the City podcast. I'm your host, Wade Brill, and I am so glad you are here. Today in the pod, we're having a really deep and real conversation about death, about planning for our death, about having conversations around death, and about the willingness to face our own emotions when it comes to death. I've been wanting to have this conversation on the podcast for a really long time because death is uncomfortable. Thinking about our own mortality, knowing that our own life is going to end at some moment, and specifically knowing that our parents' lives or our caregivers' lives are also probably in their last chapter. And knowing from my clients, people I work with, family members, that being in that sweet spot in life where you are a caretaker of aging family members, maybe while also caring for young children, can be super heavy, really stressful, really overwhelming, emotionally taxing. So I wanted to have this conversation today with Schuyler Copple, who is a Seattle-based social worker in the field of hospice. And she is very passionate about connecting people to resources and normalizing the topic of death. In this conversation, we go deep into normalizing our relationship to death, normalizing our relationship to what are we noticing as we watch our parents age? Or what are we noticing as we navigate this topic of death or learn about or see or experience more people, loved ones, family members, distant friends passing away? I also touch on the topic of avoidance, that this isn't a pleasant conversation to have at a dinner party or to talk to a family member or a loved one about. In this episode, I also share my own personal experience of losing my mother and how my siblings and I navigated that. And I never wish death upon anybody. However, it is the reality of life. And when we lose the people that we love so much, the grief is just unreal. It is so intense and so reality earth-shaking, and a huge pillar of staying centered in our lives or being centered or coming back to our centers is rooting into reality. It's learning to accept what's here, and death is very much what's here. I specifically waited to share this episode until the fall, winter season because it invites this introspection into our lives where we're watching things die, we're watching things go into hibernation, we're watching things shed and let go. And I think it's a really powerful time to think about all the ways that we can prepare and be and relate to death in a healthy way. So today on the pod, you are going to learn about some practical ways you can prepare for death, having these powerful conversations with your aging parents, to have conversations with your siblings, to have a conversation with yourself. And may you know you are never alone on the journey of death, of grief, of losing a loved one. My hope is that you'll feel just a little bit more prepared, a little bit more oriented to the process after listening to this podcast episode. So wherever you're listening in, let's settle in and let's get centered. I am really excited to announce my winter mindfulness retreat, January 16th to the 18th, the beautiful Whidbey Island here in the Pacific Northwest. This retreat is an invitation to slow down post the holiday rush, to reconnect to our mind, our bodies, our heart, and to find some clarity so that we can set intentions for the new year. I'm so excited to integrate some of my favorite practices, the intention setting party that I do every new year for the last, I think it's like 8 years now, 7 years, and to offer a mindfulness retreat where we can get quiet, where we can get still, where we can listen and nourish ourselves deeply. So if you're curious to learn more, I welcome you to head on over to retreat.centeredinthecity.org. You can learn more about the retreat, you can apply, and until the end of the month, until October 31st, you get 20% off of the rate of the room that's currently listed, early bird pricing. So if there's a little voice in your ear saying, ooh, that sounds really interesting, or, my body and heart need that, I welcome you to check it out and reach out if you have questions. Schuyler, welcome to the Center in the City podcast.
Thank you so much. It actually really genuinely is an honor to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
I'm honored and so excited to have this really necessary and heart-filled conversation. And when I met you, a month ago or whatever it was just like, I need to have you on the podcast because I have been looking to have resources and a conversation with somebody around how we get to care for our aging parents and how do we get to stay centered in that practice, because it's something I think all my listeners are dealing with now or on their way to be dealing with. And I actually just looked up some stats around boomers are 19% of the American population right now, and 10 million American millennials are caring for their aging parents. So that's about 1 in 4 families are caring for aging parents. And I know when I work with corporations, a lot of the issues that they bring up are that their employee workforce is just feeling, overwhelmed, saturated with not only work demands and technology demands and what's happening in our global world, but they're also this generation that's caring for elderly and aging parents, as well as caring for young children and their own children, and trying to grow their own families, nest eggs. So it's a lot. And I'd love to just have you share with us, what inspired you to get into the world of being a social worker with Inside Hospice, because it's just such a heavy place to be, and we need more people like you holding that heavy space for us. But yeah, what inspired you?
I was in a very in between stage in my life, in my personal life, and I was ready to pivot from the kind of work I had done for so long and truly love. And I feel like professionally, that was my first love. And the nature of that work was also very intense, very heavy. It was also a kind of field that there's a lot of vulnerability, a lot of complication, and something that people in general in our society are uncomfortable speaking about, don't know how to come alongside of it. So I was already kind of in that space of being very comfortable and wanting to come alongside of people going through not just hard things in life, but especially something that is not talked about, like approaching end of life, and the death and dying process, and caring for loved ones who are at that stage of life. So I feel like I was already well set up, just who I am and my professional background to be a good fit for this world, the world of hospice that I work in. But I also didn't know. And I started with a 3-month contract and I thought, well, I'll see how it goes. If I can do anything for 3 months, so even if it isn't a good fit, I can get through it. And that was over 4 years ago now. So I really did find that I love it. It's such an honor. And I happen to be, everyone's so different, and thank goodness that we all exist because everyone is needed. And it's an honor that I feel like I'm just a good fit for this kind of work.
What is it about end of life hospice care? Like, I didn't even notice I'm having a hard time talking about it. Like, why in our society do you think it's so difficult for us to talk about end of life death, our
Yeah.
care at this stage? Even in like, I noticed I was talking to a family member and they're in their, you know, kind of last
Mhm.
chapters in life. I mean, it could be still another 20 years, but it was difficult to even name that with them. It's like, what is it that makes us so uncomfortable?
That's an excellent question. And it's so interesting. I mean, I'm sure there's so many different factors at play. I think one of the biggest factors that contributes to that dynamic we have in our society, the discomfort, is we view, even though death is literally a part of life. We are all born and we will all die. And that is just a fact. And it's something that unites all of us, humanity. But I'm not sure where along the way we turned it into, we see it as a failure of some kind. We see it as a failure. We see it as something to fear. And we see it as something that to fight against.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that piece around failure and the fear around it. And I'm sure that there's also that, like, we don't know what comes next, right? And so there's probably even that layer too of uncertainty of like, oh, if we knew we were all headed towards this place or this experience or this
Mhm.
evolution or reincarnation or whatever belief system, it might give us some sort of ease. And obviously, depending on people's religious backgrounds and their beliefs, they might already have that to ground them or support them through. So when we think about this last chapter, how can we start to prepare now? And I say we, as in who are in this in between stage of needing to prepare and help our parents because they might still be healthy right now and feel mentally present but as I know from my own life experience, shit can change really quick. And, one of the regrets, we're so young, my siblings and I, when we lost our mom, but stuff was not organized. It was tremendously messy, her estate, having to figure out everything, being in our young 20s, not really knowing how to navigate this world. And I don't know if you can ever be fully prepared, but what are some ways that we can even just start to like have these conversations with our parents, hopefully before they get sick and go into hospice, to help them prepare for their last chapter and also help us prepare?
I so appreciate what you said at the top of you're noticing even yourself, the kind of not feeling fully comfortable with the topic and even naming it. And so I think that's a really important starting place for all of us before we even get to the point of approaching our parent or our aging neighbor who we're really close with or whoever it might be, is looking inward, noticing how am I feeling? How am I feeling? How do I feel about this, even for my own life, before you approach others about having the conversation about their own life? I think that can um, help to sort of level or balance out as you approach your parent or aging loved one, rather than coming from a position of of almost authority or a one down approach. I think that's a great place to start. And then,
Let me just even pause you there because I think highlighting that is really essential to say, hey, we got to meet ourselves and the in our relationship to the death, to the big question marks, to these uncomfortable conversations first before we can have these conversations with our loved ones. And I think that's really key. So maybe we even start there, like how do we practice meeting ourselves in those moments to have these conversations?
hmm, yeah, I mean, I think um, listening to podcast episodes like this, I think having a conversation with your set of friends or your partner, your spouse, your own doctor or your own attorney, um, doing some reading or watching just to get a bit more familiar with you. No one has to be an expert, and I'm not even, I would say, an expert in lots of ways, but just kind of leaning into what is and sitting with how it feels and becoming a bit more familiar and even saying out loud words like death, dying, end of life, advanced care planning, just becoming a little bit more familiar with it, even if it doesn't ever feel completely comfortable, that's okay. But I think that can help to kind of ease your own way, and then you are then trying to help ease the way of your parent or aging loved one.
And I think it's a really great advice to be normalizing that language and then also to be having conversations with your friends of like, hey, are you chatting with your parents about this? What is their plan? How are they prepared? Right? Like just starting to collect data from our community, I think is really essential and that we don't have to make it feel morbid, like that we can normalize it by just
Completely.
being real.
Yes, yes, you said it beautifully. Yes.
Okay, so once we've done some of this like inner work to meet ourselves, then what would you say is the next step of how we can start to approach these conversations with our parents or loved
Yeah.
ones?
Yeah, I think about ways to make it a bit easier on yourself or ourselves, and also make it a bit easier and a bit less comfortable on our parents or our aging loved ones, in a few different ways. I think when you're introducing the topic or starting the conversation or starting to ask a question, it might help to first make it about someone other than them, like start talking about someone other than them. So it could be, and everyone will find what's a natural fit for them. It could be, hey, my doctor suggested that I start reviewing this advanced care stuff in my chart. And so that had me thinking, and like, this is what and it made me curious of like, oh, this is something I haven't talked about with you, mom, or you, dad, or you, Aunt Susie. Um, and kind of leading in by first having it be about someone other than them. Or, hey, our neighbor down the street just went on hospice. And that got me thinking, this is something we haven't talked about, like what your wishes are or what you would hope for when you reach that stage of life. Also, kind of when you bring it up, and your own family. But some things to think about are moments where it might be easier are when it's relevant, when it's already happening in someone else's life. So you mentioned at the top, someone who is maybe getting closer to that stage of life. So bringing it up when it's a family friend, bringing it up when your neighbor passes away, or you could approach it from, like, I think something that when I have a conversation with my parents, sometimes it's like, hey, I was thinking about when I was younger and when Poppy died or Grandma died, and you had to do so much, and there was just so much there. What was that like for you? Um, so maybe starting with some distance, starting with some like talking about other people, and then bringing it to them, that might help them feel a bit less, if there is a level of defensiveness or if there is a level of avoidance as a result of discomfort with the topic, that those approaching it or introducing the topic in those ways might help ease that a little bit.
I love that suggestion of like how we can gently kind of butter up the conversation and slowly melt into it. And I'm curious, it got me thinking like, is this something, would you recommend having like doing this one-on-one with your parent or loved one? Or would you recommend having, a powwow if you have siblings first, and then as, you know, a threesome, a twosome, however many siblings you are, then having a conversation with your parent? Or is that maybe even too specific, like just family dependent on what works?
It's a great question because yes, it would be family dependent, but that's an important thing to think about, of what makes the most. So I am the expert on my family, you're the expert on your family. What makes the most sense? I know my parent, what makes the most sense for them? Um, what do I know about my parent or my aging loved one about how they handle just difficult topics in general? Do they prefer it to be one-on-one? Do they prefer it to be around the dinner table when we're all eating and sharing a meal and talking anyways? Like, do they prefer it when we're driving in the car so they don't have to look at me, and there's something else to focus on? So I think you brought up a great question of that's another way we can be preparing of like what makes the most sense for my parent or my aging loved one. If you're lucky enough to have a close dynamic with all of your siblings, I think that is really great and really beautiful, and could be very practical if your parent or parents do not have a durable power of attorney already, because at least in the state of Washington, if someone does not have a durable power of attorney, DPOA or healthcare proxy, and they become unable to make medical decisions for themselves, the decision-making power, is required to be their legal next of kin. So it would be their spouse if they're legally married, even if they've been separated for 10 years, if they're still legally married, it is that person who would have to make the decision, sign the consent forms, all that stuff. Or if you are not legally married, then the decision-making power goes to the adult children. And if you have 5 kids, all 5 have to be in agreement. It's not just like, oh, well, the older brother, he always makes the decision. Like, no, if like it will be the hospital or hospice agency or whoever needing decisions, needing paper signed, they're going to be contacting all 5 kids. I'm kind of getting sidetracked, but you bring up a good point of considering what is my family dynamic and what might make the most sense for my parent. How can I best set them up well to be as comfortable as possible having this conversation or being asked these questions?
Yeah, God. I mean, right when you talked about medical, what is the correct term?
Durable power of attorney, which you can have for healthcare, which would be medical specific, or you can have for finances only, or you can have it for both.
So I remember being in the hospital in New York, and my mom, we had just brought her in to Memorial Sloan Kettering because she was having these really intense symptoms. Her like eyes were turning yellow, and she was like not present. And when she kind of got stabilized and we were in the hospital room with her, my siblings and I remember one of the doctors or nurses came in and said, "Hey, we need somebody to sign, like who's going to be in charge of, of decision making." And I guess maybe in New York State, there's one person because my brother signed. And I remember him kind of having this moment of my mom was even like, "Don't worry, you won't need to do that, But we did. We don't think it's going to happen. We don't think our loved ones are going to die. We know somewhere back in our brain it's going to happen, right? Because everything is born and everything dies, and that is the circle of life. However, we again put it off. And so it's like, okay, how can we start to have these conversations slowly? Because I think what you're pointing to, Schuyler, which makes so much sense, is it can be incremental. Like, can we start to bring and normalize the language of death, the language of end of life, the language of hospice in childhood, right? Like throughout our life, that this is what happens. And then be able to, as our parents are getting older, to even just be curious about what their desires are or what their needs are. And I remember having conversations with my mom of, how do you want to die? And her mother got hit by a car and so was in the ICU unit and like attached to all this equipment for a really long time, which is how my mother ended up passing away and how she always wished she wouldn't have passed away. And so we had talked about that. And so my siblings and I knew her wishes, and we were trying to also hold her wishes for end of life care with what the doctors were telling us and what we were hoping would happen. And then it hit that point of, she's declining, she's not coming back. And so that's when we knew we kind of needed to call it. So having those pre-conversations, we could hold her truth, even if it was really hard for us to hold ourselves. I'm curious, like, what would you suggest would be a next step? So it's like you're starting to have these conversations with your parents, you're normalizing these languages, you're getting it sounds like legal paperwork in order of who has the power of attorney. Kind of like what else do we need? Like, what are some of the things that we don't think we need to have in order or talk about that are really important to make a priority?
Yes. So many things you just said, I want to comment on. It was so good. I 100% agree. I think you said it's like in incremental steps. In the world of hospice, we kind of say it's like planting seeds. So this definitely will not be a one and done conversation. Even if you have a parent or aging loved one who is willing to have a conversation, this is never a one time thing. But especially if your parent is more hesitant or slightly more avoidant of this topic, it is several conversations over time. And if they're not quite open at first, I would say don't be discouraged, because sometimes it does take someone hearing something several times or coming back to the topic several times, before they're willing to lean in and discuss it. And there will be, and I have seen it several times, there will be people who they just, it's their life, their choice, and they just literally decide, no, I don't ever want to talk about it. And that can be really hard to stand by and witness. Um, but that's what you have to do because it is their choice, to maybe never ever be willing to talk about it. It makes it harder on the family. Yeah, I see that a lot too. The story you shared about your own experience and with your mom and your siblings in the hospital is so, so very common. And I'm sure, probably even people listening will be able to relate to what you shared. That's incredibly common. You, I would say, are lucky in the sense of having siblings that it sounds like you were kind of on the same page or in agreement or on each other's team. It becomes even way more complicated when that is not the case, which I've also seen where different siblings have different ways of handling tough situations. And when there's not agreement, it can prolong or delay certain care that the person might need or want. And something I didn't say earlier, I think another important piece of when you do have these multiple conversations, over time with your parents is, as you introduce the topic or as you circle back to the topic, always asking for permission, essentially getting consent of, are you open to talking about this with me? Or okay, I hear you. You don't want to talk about this right now. How will you know when you're ready to talk about it with me? Or could you, I'm curious, who would you be, more comfortable talking about this with. As you're talking with your parents, be open to wherever they are, and you can always glean something from the conversation. So you might have a parent where they don't want to talk about the feeling stuff, or like what is a good death, or they might not want to go there, but they might feel more comfortable with, like, okay, the logistics and the practicalities and the paperwork. Like, so I would say, as you're feeling out, or as you are talking with your parents, kind of go in the direction they're willing to go, especially starting out.
That's so helpful to really think about. You have to kind of let go of your agenda and follow them, of like what's the path of least resistance to enter in. I know for my siblings and I, when we had a first conversation around, this was probably in 2019. So 6 years ago, we brought up a conversation with my dad, and we had a Zoom. We all live in different places. And so we had a Zoom meeting, and we were like, okay, Dad, just orient us to what your plans are and what your estate kind of looks like, and what's your debt, and what are your possessions, and just trying to orient around his picture, because we can think we know what his picture looks like, but we don't have any idea. And so having those questions, and then we were like, okay, great, well, let's have another conversation in a year. And then of course, the pandemic happened and life went sideways, and we had other priorities. And luckily my dad is still very healthy and alive, but in the back of my mind, I hear a little voice of, you need to have another conversation. Like, you need to keep this up, because I know from past experience, I don't want to look back and say, oh, I wish we were more proactive. And so that's giving me, like, I'm thinking of my future self here and reminding myself of, like, oh, we need to face this uncomfortableness, or we just need to fit this in, even if it's not fun or sexy. We need to have these conversations to just move things forward. And so I've even had little mini conversations of, hey, Dad, like, if you need help, I can, come by this summer and we can start to go through your things, and slowly, again, having these kinds of conversations. And it's reminding me that my next action step is to set up another family Zoom for us to just retouch base here. I'm curious, like, when people come into hospice, or even are preparing for hospice, first of all, maybe even just define what hospice is for listeners in case they're not aware. And then what are some of the welcome guidelines and like processes that you walk people through as they're transitioning into that chapter?
Yeah. So hospice is specialized medical care for someone, and for their family or support network at a really unique stage of life, when it appears that someone might have 6 months or less in their natural life. If they Sometimes it's because there are no more treatment options for their illness or disease. Sometimes the treatments that were available are no longer working. Sometimes it's that they're either physically, their body, or just sort of emotionally, they reach a point where, with the time and energy I have left on this in this life, I don't want to keep using it to go out to all of these various specialty medical appointments and tests and procedures. I never want to see the inside of an emergency room again. I never want to be hospitalized again. I would rather shift the goal of what my medical care has been, which up until this stage of life, it's been, of course, focused on curative treatment, slowing progression of disease, strengthening rehab, getting better, and shift the goal of their care over to, I want to be comfortable. I want my symptoms to be well managed. I want to have the support. I want to be in my home or wherever I'm living and around the people I love, and spend my time and energy in that way, doing what I love, being where I love, being around who I love. Um, so it's for people, so hospice is for people who are at that stage of life and choose this for their medical care. Hospice does not, shorten life. It does not extend life. We're really there to provide comfort and support to someone through in their last months and weeks and days and hours, minutes of life. And the the hope of hospice is that we provide holistic support, which is why there is not just a nurse and a doctor with hospice. That's why you have a whole care team to support the entire person and family or support network. That's why, in addition to a nurse and a doctor, you have a social worker to support around the emotional needs, practical needs. That's why you have also a hospice chaplain to provide spiritual support, which for some people it is religious. For lots of other people, spiritual support is not at all religious. And there's also a bath aide, like a CNA, as part of the care team.
What I hear is like, wow, you're lucky if you end in hospice.
100%.
So, like, hospice doesn't sound like this death sentence. It really sounds like this gift of how we can end life more on our terms
Yes.
versus sudden death, heart attack, a horrible accident, ICU unit, whatever it is.
Full opportunity for the people who choose it for their medical care. um it is a choice, so they first have to be willing to have the conversation and to accept that they are at that stage of life. And also, some people don't choose hospice, and that's okay. I say a lot, like, your life, your choice. Some people would rather continue doing what they're doing, which will ultimately mean they either unfortunately pass away at home, not comfortable, or they end up passing away at the hospital. And if you're okay with that, cool. But a lot of people don't want to be in pain and don't want to be in the hospital. So hospice is a really beautiful opportunity that you can choose for how you want your death to, where and how you want your death to happen, if you're already at that stage of life. Yeah.
I'm curious, when you think of hospice, is it specifically in your home or is it a place that people go to or
So
both?
that's a great question. That's a great question. So in Washington State, majority of hospice by far is community based, which means it is in your home or wherever you're living. You might be in your own home, living with a relative, living in a skilled nursing facility, living in an adult family home, kind of wherever home is for you, hospice comes to you. We have, and we're here in Seattle, which is in King County, Washington. I think there is one hospice house or hospice center that one of the hospice agency has, and it is for people who are on hospice whose symptom management needs are such that they can't be managed in a home setting. They have to be in a facility setting, kind of like similar to a hospital, but not the hospital. So it's not the majority. That's very, very few people who go somewhere to be on hospice. By far, majority is wherever home is for you.
Hmm. Have you seen the Netflix show? No, it's not Netflix. I think it's Hulu called Dying for Sex.
Not yet. My cousin told me about this. I have to watch it.
Okay, I highly recommend it. I cried, laughed through the whole season. And ooh, okay, I won't spoil it for people, but there is exploration around in the title, dying, and it's about a woman who has cancer and kind of her last wishes of like how to live life fully when she's given this terminal diagnosis, and what going into hospice looks like for her and how to just feel more empowered around death. And anyway, really, really beautiful invitation for us all to just look at our relationship to death. And I'm curious, when you are working with families and you're working with the patients who are saying yes to hospice, what are some of the common things you're hearing as they're on their deathbed?
Hmm. The majority of folks that I have worked with on hospice are um, in their late years of life. There are some tragic cases where, I mean, I worked with someone who was 26 and she was um, dying of some kind of cancer. I forget. I've worked with a 34-year-old mom of two kids who's on hospice. So there are really tragic cases where they are at that stage of life, but the majority of people, and I think this is probably, I don't know the statistics across the US, that would be something I'd be interested to look in. I think the majority of people, at least here, who are on hospice are in their late years of life. Um, and the majority of people I have talked to are generally okay with being at that stage of life. They're generally at peace with, like, I've lived a full life, I've had a good life, I'm ready to go. A lot of people I've talked with, there is that level of acceptance. I have found, and that's not, some people are, of course, not peaceful and are maybe scared or are maybe worried and are not sure what comes next or don't want to be at this stage of life, even if they are 93 years old and they've been sick for a long time. They still don't want to be at the stage of life where it's approaching end of life. But the majority, I would say, of folks I've worked with are kind of in that acceptance and at peace. Sometimes it is harder for the family members to be in a peaceful, accepting place. So sometimes the hospice care team, in some ways, is at least as much of a support. Sometimes the social worker and chaplain are more of a support to the family members of the person on hospice than to the person on hospice themselves.
So, as we get to think about death and how we are intentionally living, I'm even curious, for people listening, and I know maybe this is even just Washington state specific, but what are some of the options out there of how we can have maybe a little bit more control, if any, or just the intention of how we would like to die? Because I know there's death with dignity. I think there's some other choices. If you can explain the choices that we have and what they mean, that would be amazing.
Yes, another great question. So there's there is palliative care, there is hospice, there is home health, there is death with dignity, which might also be called physician aid in dying, or might also be called medical aid in dying, which is legal here in Washington state, has been for a while, and is legal in several other states as well. Home health is in-home services when you are still working on wanting to try to slow down disease progression, wanting to try to build up strength, rehab, things like that. So home health services usually comes before any of these other services I'm about to explain. I mention home health because oftentimes it gets confused with palliative care or hospice. So I just wanted to call that out. Palliative care is an additional layer of support for someone who maybe has a chronic illness or a life-limiting illness, but maybe you still have, I don't know, 2 to 5 years life expectancy. So you're not right at the end, but you do have a condition or combination of diseases that are chronic or maybe life-limiting. Palliative care focuses on helping you as the person and your family or support system think about, in the future, what is important to you? What are your values? What kind of care do you want? What do you not want? In what situations might you want this versus that? So palliative care works to help keep someone comfortable, manage their symptoms, but also is very supportive around some of that advanced care planning. Advanced care planning is like thinking about, talking about, and documenting what's important to you, what your wishes are, sometimes filling out paperwork so that you are set up or your family is set up to not have to make any decisions. Like you are in charge, you're making decisions for your future medical care. You can be on palliative care while you are still going to various doctor's appointments, having procedures, getting treatment, maybe being hospitalized. Palliative care is this additional layer of support that's really, really great. And again, is a choice for people while you're not yet at the end of life. Hospice then comes into play or becomes an option for someone when they are in that last stage of life, when they likely have months left to live rather than years left to live. And again, that's months without treatments or interventions that would extend or prolong your life. And then death with dignity or medical aid in dying, physician aid in dying, is an option that for people who are already dying, for people who already have a terminal prognosis. So because of their disease progression or combination of diseases or illness, a doctor has deemed they likely have 6 months or less. That is who qualifies to choose death with dignity, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful choice that we have here in Washington State and a few other states. It gives someone the option to, again, choose like hospice, and you can be on hospice and choose death with dignity at the same time. We've had several hospice patients go that route. It gives someone the control of, okay, I'm already dying, but I'm going to do it this way before I lose all of my independence and can't get out of bed, before I reach, maybe I don't want to reach the point of needing so many pain medications, before I am not alert and can no longer like speak with my family members. It gives them the option. So, but it is someone who is already at that stage of life. And I do want to clarify, death with dignity, medical aid and dying, physician aid in death is not suicide. Sometimes those things get the words are used interchangeably, and those are two very different things. Someone doing death with dignity is someone who is already dying, not by their choice. They are at that state. They are at the end of their life. Someone who dies by suicide, I guess someone who dies by suicide could be at the end of their life. Majority of the time, they're not. They are making the choice to end their life. So those are two very different things. And the term euthanasia, I think, is an older term. That is different than death with dignity, because with death with dignity, you have to be able to take the medication yourself. So someone is not administering the medication to you. It is not a doctor, pushing something into your veins or giving you something to swallow. It is something that you are taking yourself.
Wow, so interesting. I know two people, one here in Seattle and one in the Netherlands, that just decided to go through with death with dignity and have that practice. And one of them had their family completely surrounded by them, as they talk, actually I guess both of them had their family around them, had some intentionality with the process. And I think like what a gift if we can all pass in that way of choice.
Sorry, one more thing I'll say about that, death with dignity. In Washington State, we have a great organization called End of Life Washington, and I'll include that in the resources. And they presented at a hospice conference I went to last year, and it was so interesting to learn that of the people who go through the intense process, you have to meet with two doctors, and you have to, it's not an easy or simple thing to come to go through the death with dignity process. But of the people who did choose to do that, and most of them are on hospice, maybe all of them are on hospice, they, even getting the medication, gave them a sense of control. And there's lots of people who get the medication and don't end up taking it. But it's just, I thought that was a beautiful example of death with dignity, even for people who don't complete the process, but engaging with it gives them a sense of choice, and empowerment and security in their own life being at the end of life.
I'm curious from your experience being a social worker in these settings, what do you observe externally as you're seeing a patient and even internally as you see somebody take their last few breaths?
Generally speaking, with the dying process, so of course, everyone is different, but there are general signs and symptoms of someone when it appears that they might have 3, 4 days left, hours left, minutes left. Generally, when someone is at the stage of life where they're in their last couple of days, a lot of times they're not conversant, they are not alert, their breathing is different. They might be like reaching in the air, almost picking at things. So it was very helpful when I started in hospice to be trained and educated on what might appear to the untrained eye as discomfort or weird or they're not okay is actually a very normal, like this is what the body does when it's at this stage of life. I heard a hospice nurse kind of mention or give the comparison of, the body knows what to do when it's giving birth. The body goes through, like the body does what it does in labor and giving birth, natural childbirth. Similarly, the body knows what to do in the last days and minutes of life. And the body, we follow the person's body as it's doing what it does. And we're there to help make sure there's not, because unfortunately, in the natural process, pain is very common. Sometimes agitation or anxiety is very common. Sometimes shortness of breath or nausea is very common. And so it's very important to manage any symptoms that might come up. Outside of that, the body is doing the natural process and we follow it.
I remember being in my mom's room at the ICU unit. The nurse said to my siblings and I, like, hey, this is kind of end of the road. What would you like to do? And that's when we agreed to turn off all of the machines. And she said, okay, we'll let you know, like this could take a while, and we'll let you know kind of the signs when it's starting to get close. And I can't remember what it was, but it was like a few hours later, and we came back to the hospital. And we sat with her, as the beeping got slower, and she was intubated. And so there was no kind of last breath that we could see in her mouth. But I remember having my hands on her legs and my siblings being around her, a few family friends, my aunt, uncle, one of my aunts and uncles, and um, just like knowing that she was taking her last few breaths. And I've talked to a few other mindfulness and meditation teachers of like what a gift it is to be with somebody as they pass, to be able to hold that space for them as they take their last breath. And I remember being the only one not crying at the moment. Not to say that's good or bad, just noticing of like, I was so focused on my mom. And I specifically remember thinking, wow, she has so much beautiful energy that the world continues to need. And I remember just kind of like visualizing sucking in some of her energy and feeling like I could just kind of absorb it. And that was the last time that I got to be with her living, breathing body. And, it's really intense to see somebody you love die, and especially in a way that is not necessarily their choice. And my hope, in having this conversation is that even in the pain, even in the uncomfortableness, we get through it. And how can we all be a little bit more prepared for this natural cycle of life? We talk about birth, we talk about getting pregnant. I think even more and more women are getting comfortable with talking about their stories and their processes of giving birth. But yeah, how can we even start to normalize this process of death more and more so it's not this like big, ugly, hairy surprise? It's all going to
Right.
happen to us. I had a babysitter once say, the only thing you have to do in life is pay taxes and die.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't get home insurance, renter's insurance, car insurance because we think a storm is going to blow off our roof or we're going to get in this our awful car crash. We get it so that we're okay if something does happen. And I think preparing for end of life is even more important because it's not an if it's going to happen, it is when and how, which we don't know. But being prepared, um, yeah, but being prepared for the inevitable can feel so empowering, and I view it as really an act of love for myself and for my family. I feel very lucky that my both of my parents are still living, and they're both very open to having the conversations, many conversations. One of someone I used to be very close with, she joked about my family, the Copple family, and the Adams family, da 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 da. She would do that about our family because so often at the dinner table or whatever, a topic related to death would come up. She's like, "Oh, the Copples are at it again."
I love that. Okay, so just to kind of recap for listeners, what are some of the things that would be helpful, like a checklist to think about that we as an individual need to maybe have an order or even have prepared for our aging parents?
There's wonderful resources out there that I will include. There's things like the Five Wishes booklet. There are like guides and toolkits to help someone think through and even write through sometimes what matters to them, what kinds of decisions you might have to make, how to even choose someone you would trust to make decisions for you if you're no longer able to make them. So there's lots of great resources, death doulas, which are becoming a lot more and more people, which I'm very glad to see. It's becoming more normalized. That is a great resource in terms of conversations, ongoing conversations, and support for someone who is approaching end of life. And how do we talk about it? How can we support them? They're just a wealth of information and another great source of education. So I'll also include that in the resource list.
Amazing. Thank you, Schuyler, so much for sharing your wisdom and your insight with us. And thank you for being a, an angel that gets to support people transitioning.
Thank you so much, Wade. I thank you for doing your part in normalizing this topic and being willing to have a conversation about it and share pieces of your own story as well. Thank you so much.
And thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode of the Centered in the City podcast. Schuyler has gifted us with so many amazing resources, so I welcome you to head on over to the show notes and check them out, whether it's podcast episodes, templates, reflection prompts. She has given us so many tools that we can dig in deeper on our own. And as you listen to this episode, I welcome you to let it all settle and really think about what's one nugget that you're walking away with. What's one nugget of insight or wisdom that you want to integrate into your life. Maybe that's taking a moment to sit with yourself and think about, how am I actually feeling about my parents dying one day? Or what's my own relationship to death? Or how would I want to die? Maybe it's emailing your family or your siblings or your parents and scheduling that first meeting to just bravely start to have the conversation. Or maybe your next step is to check out some of these resources that Schuyler shared and see where you want to go next. I welcome you to share this episode with somebody in your community because death is something that connects us all. It is part of the human process. So share it with somebody that you know is really curious to explore death or needs some more support as they're helping their aging parents or wants to feel a little bit more resourced as they're navigating. Thank you for being here. And until next time, stay centered.